Hey, what's up, dudes? We're back for another video. Yeah, I'm saying it again because what else do you say in the beginning of these videos? I have no idea. Today, I got something really cool for you guys that I feel like a lot of people are overlooking while setting up their DSLRs, their mirrorless cameras, their GoPros, or whatever else they're using in terms of streaming with the camera. You know what I mean? We all know like C920s and those kind of webcam style where you sit on top of the monitor and you're able to set like brightness values and whatnot, but you're not really able to get in there and tweak the settings that are inside these mirrorless cameras or DSLRs in general. And there's a lot of stuff I'm going to cover here today. Hope you guys are down because we're going over f-stop, shutter speed, shutter angle, film sensitivity, ISO, ASA, white balance, all that stuff, man, so that you guys understand exactly how to set up your cameras to get the best quality out of those cameras. We're starting that off right now. I flipped my room around. So normally my desk used to be on that side of the room, but now we're on this side of the room. So hope you guys are okay with that. I thought, you know, I needed something new after TwitchCon, after those vlogs and everything. I had to flip it around, man. I got kind of tired of the old routine that my body was going through. It doesn't matter. Let's get into it, dude. We're gonna jump over to these cameras right here. I actually got two cameras I want to go over. Maybe in the future I can go over other things like GoPros and stuff like that. But I got two cameras today. One is a Sony A7S, and that's what you're looking at here. And then we got ourselves a secondary camera, and that's this G7, which is up here sitting on top of my Sony A7S. Now I know this looks a lot different and the framing's not perfect. I couldn't really get it. I don't have the right gear to make that all nice and pretty for you guys without messing with other shit. Doesn't matter. We're going to try to go over this today. I'm going to show you exactly how to set up your cameras. I'm going to try to dial these in as super similar as humanly possible before tweaking and going over every single setting and what it looks like on two different cameras. Not every camera is the same. All DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are all different in terms of their sensor sizes and all that kind of stuff. So just so you guys know, they're gonna look different. It's lens dependent, and there's a whole bunch of stuff to go over here. Without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and jump in, and I'm gonna go ahead and turn on the overlays for this camera and the other cameras so you can see exactly what we're dealing with here. Now you're gonna see a lot of stuff on screen, and I keep going back and forth looking at I forget which camera I have selected. Okay, so what I wanted to go over here is you see how many settings are just all around my screen right now. The first time you turn on your camera, you're going to see like, dude, what is all of this, man? Like, I don't know what I'm looking at. When you're first booting up your camera, there's like around four key things you got to look at. Okay. 1 is your f-stop. 2 is your shutter angle or shutter speed. 3 is your ISO, and 4, white balance. We'll call it that. Let's start off with the Sony A7S and kind of give you guys an idea of the things that you guys need to pay attention to. Okay, so there's a lot of steps to go through in terms of when you want to use a camera and whatnot. The first thing you have to look for is your frame rate. Do you want 60 FPS? Do you want 24 FPS? Do you want 30 FPS? Those are kind of like the big three. Technically, 24 is called 23.976. Some cameras will say 24. There's also PAL versions, 25, all that stuff. But you got to figure out what frame rate you want to deal with. Right now, we are sitting at 60 frames per second. That's the 60p up there, 60 frames. And if I go back to the other camera, you can see the FPS right here where it says 60p. Again, that is the frame rate that I'm putting out, 60 FPS. Both these cameras are set to 60, and you can kind of see it with the motion of how smooth everything feels and looks, and it's almost a little bit not hyper real, but it's real. So once you determine what you want, I've always done 60 FPS. It looks really clean. It looks really smooth. Now, granted, in movies are usually at 23.976 or 24 FPS. That is what looks most natural to the human eye. And it's just that it has like a little bit more cinematic look to the cameras. Moving past that, once you find your frame rate, i.e. 60 FPS or 23 or 30 or whatever you want to choose, then you got to start to look at exposure. Now, I'm using this as the scene, okay? This is my scene. I set it up. I got some lights in the background. I got a light on my face, light coming over here, hitting the edge of me. You can see on my arm, I got that hard edge of light right there. Okay, so this is my camera setup. Now, the first thing I want to look at is my shutter speed. I will tell you guys that this number down here, this 1/80, is your shutter speed. Now that is how long each frame, each one of those 60 frames that are in my thing here, every time one of those little tiny frames comes up, 1 out of the 60, it is taking 1/80th of a second exposure. So that means that the motion blur, the smaller this number, the 1/ whatever that number is, the smaller that number, the more motion blur there's gonna be. Okay, with old cameras, the shutter in the camera is a physical thing that shows the sensor of your camera that exposes the film or whatever, and then closes back down. Now, the length of time that shutter is open is based on that number right down there. That 1/80th is 1/80th of a second it is open and then it closes. The smaller that number goes, the 1/80, let's say it's 1/3 or 1/4, you're doing 1/4 of a second that shutter is open before it closes again, okay? And it does that 60 times a second, okay? So let me show you a quick example of what exactly it looks like when I change the shutter speed to a lower shutter. Now, I'll demonstrate it with the other camera because the other one goes a little bit further. So with this camera here, right now, we are sitting at the 1/80th. Now, on this camera, it doesn't show the 1/80. It's just showing 80. So that's my shutter speed. So now let me set that to something very low. Let me show you what this looks like. Now I changed it to 15. You can see how much motion blur is happening with my hand right now, right? And that's because the shutter is only open for 1/15th of a second. That's actually a slower opening of the shutter and closing than that 1/80th. So for 1/15th of a second, the shutter is now open and closing. That's why there's all this motion blur. Now let me do the exact opposite and push it to something way high. And you're gonna see that going from this to, so now the shutter is 1/320th of a second. So now the shutter's opening for 1/320th of a second. One, you get it, and closing. So that is very fast, man. And it's doing that 60 times per second. So now you can see that the motion blur looks really fucking strange, right? It's looking very weird. You can see like all weird kind of stuff happen. Like there is no real motion blur. Like this is why they usually have these modes for like sports games or something like that. So you can see every little bit because you don't want to see, you know, someone getting tackled with a slow shutter speed because you're going to have that blur. You're not going to be able to see if that foot touches this section or that ball hits the bat in a certain way or something like that. You know what I mean? This will allow you to see almost each individual frame without any motion blur. So the higher that number goes, making the shutter open and close faster makes there almost no motion blur at all. Now think about a speeding bullet. Now if a speeding bullet comes flowing through here right now, you would have a little bit of motion blur because that bullet is traveling so fast. Now, the higher I go on that number, the 1/320th of a second, the more you would actually see the physical bullet within the 60 frames per second rather than a little tiny blur going past your screen every 60 seconds. You know what I'm saying? That is what shutter speed is. And generally, a good place to start is to leave it at something. I keep looking at this camera and it's that camera. I don't know why I keep doing this. It's very hard because I'm usually looking at this camera when I'm streaming, not this one. So sorry about that. Right now, the generic thing you want to do, whatever frame rate you're shooting at, you want to double that shutter speed number to whatever the frame rate is. Right now, we are shooting at 60 FPS, so the closest thing I can get to 120 is the 125. Generally, this number down here is 125. They don't really do 120. I'm not really sure why they come up with those. I don't know why these numbers exist, the 125th, 180th, all that stuff. I'm shooting 60 FPS, so I double that, and I just round up a little bit because I'm forced to. So we're shooting at 125th of a second right now, and that gives me almost the normal your eyes motion blur on what you're seeing. Now, there is still a little bit of motion blur in there, and there's still a little, you know, there's also this lighting is kind of messing it up. Like, that's a whole nother topic, is that lights have their own frequencies. So if I were to like flip back to my my Sony a7S, now watch these lights in the background here, and as I change the shutter speed, when I lower the brightness of my camera, you see these little stroby lines and whatnot. Now that's because of the shutter angle or the shutter speed trying to match the frequency of the lights in the background. Now this one, you can see a very subtle flash, and over here you see these subtle lines and whatnot. Some lights will be more affected than others, and that has to do with motion blur as well. And so that's shutter speed. It does control light. So the higher you set that speed, the faster the shutter opens and closes, the more the camera is going to get darker or brighter. Because of how long the shutter is up for and goes back down, it allows more light to go in for a little bit before the shutter comes back down and closes off the light. So I'll do a quick example on the Lumix G7 here. And you can see just like that, when I'm changing that shutter now to 1/800th of a second, you see how much light I just lost. And if I, vice versa, if I go back the other way, now you can see just how much more light I get. Don't look at my bear, dude. It was a gift. But now you can see how much more light I get. So that's another thing to think about when you're running out of options in terms of your exposure of your apartment or your stream office. Adjusting the shutter could give you what you want in terms of exposure if you can't do any more with your lens or your ISO in camera, which is essentially your sensitivity of your sensor. So moving on to the next part, we're going to talk about the ISO, because ISO is huge. You can see right now my ISO on this camera, the G7 right now, is sitting at 3200. Now the larger that number, the more light gets absorbed into the camera. However, it comes with a cost. And the cost is usually you get more grain, you get more gross of an image, but by doing that, it allows you to utilize lenses a little bit better and get the best out of your lens in terms of the quality that it's trying to provide you in certain situations. But it's also, it's kind of like a low light situation, right? If all my lights are off or all my lights are on and it's too dark still, the ISO is a really good way to bump up your exposure to allow you to see more at the cost of a little bit uglier of an image. And let me go ahead and max out this camera and show you exactly what I mean in terms of the noise and the grossness of this sensor, because it's a micro four thirds, a very tiny sensor, and I'm trying to essentially artificially up the gain, up the brightness of it to make it accommodating for the lighting that's in my office right now. So if I change it, so now I've adjusted the shutter angle to compensate so you guys can actually see what's happening. But now, like, if you look at this wall right here, you can see a lot of nasty grain and whatnot. A lot of, like, it doesn't look that good. You know, if I were to zoom in a little bit or something like that, you could really see all like just the grossness. It's not even that bad. It's just somewhat bad. But if you go over back to my A7S, now again, this camera is sitting at its maximum ISO, which is 6400, and generally, like, that is for when you're shooting at nighttime or indoors, and you know, bear with, or maybe your lens doesn't open up to allow a lot of light in as well. But if I go back to my Sony A7S, this camera is sitting at 250, ISO 250, and that's because of the lens and the sensor quality of Sony's A7S, or other cameras out there too, but I just happen to pick a sensor that allows me to be very flexible with my lighting. I can literally light an entire scene with just my my phone's flashlight if I chose to, but you can see already, like, you're not seeing a lot of grain. Now, let me boost this camera and you'll see exactly how bad these cameras can get the higher you up that ISO. ISO is your sensitivity of your sensor, and, you know, higher numbers equals lower light situations at the cost of getting grain. And the smaller the number, generally you get way less grain for your stream or your camera or whatever you're recording. Now I've upped the ISO to 102,400 ISO. That is a lot. And you can see just how much I'm compromising when I switch to that high ISO. You can see a lot more noise, especially in my my t-shirt and whatnot. A microphone, you can see noise jumping all over the place. Back here on the wall just looks nasty, right? That's ISO sensitivity. Now let me go back down to a normal sensitivity here. Okay, so now we're back, and now you can see exactly how clean all that noise is. You don't really see it. It's there, and I can boost it up to make you see it more. But with that said, you can see how much cleaner the image looks. So the next part I want to go over is this thing called f-stop. Now, f-stop is the amount of light that gets onto your sensor, but using the lens. So this number down here, that 4.0, that is my f-stop for this lens in particular, because at this focal length, which is about a 35 millimeter focal length, just like my Sony A7S, it only allows me to get to a 4.0 or f4 as my my exposure. Now, the higher that number goes, the less light hits the sensor and the darker the image gets. And let me show you right now. By changing this number right here to a 7, an f7.1, you can see just how much darker the image is. But there's also something else to keep in mind. When you are changing your f-stop, you are also changing how shallow your depth of field is. The higher the f-stop goes, if you put your f-stop to an f16, you're essentially allowing more of your world through the lens to be in focus. Now, the smaller that number, shallower depth of field. Let me switch back to my Sony, and if I go over here, you can see just how shallow depth of field this camera actually has. Let me switch off some menus here. So you can see just how blurry my background is, and you can see, you know, the lights back here a little blurred out. You can barely make out what the hell is on this thing. It looks like there's a creepy doll back there, or maybe there, I don't know, there actually is, but you know, you see how much blurrier things get, and as my hand comes closer, you can see it gets sharp right about here, but as soon as I push beyond that, look at my tattoo, getting closer, it gets out of focus. So you can see just how much depth of field I have and how much of it I can utilize. So I have maybe about this much room to kind of play with me going in and out of focus before it becomes way noticeable and I'm out of focus back here. You know what I mean? Like this looks off. It looks bad. The smaller the number, the more shallower depth of field you get. And right now, this camera, my Sony a7S, has a 35mm Rokinon lens on it. That right now, that f-stop is set to f1.5. Now you remember the 4.0 on the G7. Now the 4 allows you to kind of see some detail back here. As soon as you open up the lens to a certain number, boom, now this is all super out of focus. And let me show you exactly what this 4.0 looks like on my A7S. So let me swap it. Right now we're sitting at the 1.5. And then here is what it looks like at a 4.0. Now it's very similar to the G7. However, I had to compensate with my ISO to be able to get the same exposure. So again, I up my film sensitivity to compensate for the f-stop, because my f-stop, it technically opens up more to get more light in. But like, let's pretend this lens only opens up. And when I say opens up, that is the maximum light that can come into the lens. So if you open up your iris, your f-stop, you were physically opening up the aperture, kind of like my logo. You were opening it up more. The more you have it open, the more light comes through and the shallower depth of field you can get. The more you close, the less light comes through and everything becomes more in focus. Right now, this lens is open to a 4.0. You can see a lot more stuff in my background. You know, you see the little remote hanging off my skateboard there. You see a little more detail in that this is a bear. You know, you can see that, you know, there is a doll back there. You can see his arms and limbs and his little head. And let me show you an extreme example. And let me bump up my ISO and close down on my f-stop so you can see a lot back there. And again, it'll kind of be like what we just saw a minute ago. Let me show you how much I can get in focus. You know, again, I had to bump up my ISO to be able to do this, but now you can see a ton of detail. You can see the tripod that the microphone's sitting on. You can see detail in the bear. You can see, you know, the ball bearings of my skateboard. You can see just a lot more detail in the background than you were a second ago. You can see that my AC unit right here, you can see the individual, you know, blades right here and whatnot, where the air is sucked in. You know what I mean? The more you close down the lens, the f-stop being higher, the less amount of light comes into the camera, and you have to compensate by either changing your shutter angle or your sensitivity. Now, I see this in a lot of people's streams and it bugs me. I don't like seeing this number high because of the movement. I would rather sacrifice and see a more grainy, ugly image than to see high or really not high motion blur, like the opposite, like a very high shutter angle. Just looks weird to my eye. If you've ever seen the movie 28 Days Later, they shot that on a very extreme shutter angle, or shutter speed if you want. They shot on mini DV, and so their shutter speed was insanely high. I think it was 1/2000. So let me switch over to 1/2000 of shutter speed, and let me show you exactly what that looks like. Aha! So I hit that great shutter speed, which started to make these lights look really strange. But with that said, you can see how just it looks weird when I'm moving around. You know, when I have my my hood moving, when I'm moving around, it just looks too crisp and sharp and feels really unnatural when I'm moving around. Like, this is what they do for like zombie movies and whatnot, when someone's like chasing after you and it looks all crazy and whatnot. It just looks more intense, right? Now let me go back to my original shutter here, because this 2000 thing is driving me up a wall, just like seeing that motion blur and seeing that light do that thing. Oh boy. So you can see how much different. So now if I'm doing zombie stuff, it doesn't look as intense because the motion blur is now less, it's less crazy. Like, you see more motion blur, your eye's able to like process it as it's not like super crazy. It looks a little bit more natural. And this looks way better than that last shit, which looked insane. And I see a lot of people using their shutter angle to get the exposure, and it just doesn't look as good, man. It just does not look as good. And so generally when people are changing that number to make it higher, it's because their rooms are too bright and they're trying to compensate for the exposure by using the shutter speed. to stop down the light in a sense because it's too bright. You know what I mean? So that covers shutter speed, that covers film sensitivity, and that covers f-stop. Now, those are the three big ones that I definitely wanted to talk to you guys about. And another one I wanted to talk to you guys about is about white balance. It turns out that I'm at 4,800 Kelvin. Kelvin is the scale of color temperature. Anyways, so when you're in your camera settings, you have this thing called white balance. And again, that is what your white is set to. So if you see something that should be white light and your camera seeing is a different color, your white balance will help you change that to the correct white. Now, right now we are sitting at 4,800. When you go through a camera settings, you have multiple different options. Usually they have like a sunlight, a nighttime, an overcast. Let me show you those right now. There's a lot of options there. And if I had something like a white piece of paper, that'd be nice, but I don't. So I'm going to show you guys exactly the two extremes of the lighting. So right now we're sitting at 4,800, which is a great, you know, I feel like that makes it look a little bit more normal. I feel like the warmth from this light here in front of me makes my skin look a little more like I'm tan, maybe like I was hanging out outside in Long Beach, California or something like that. I'm actually in New York. I'm in Brooklyn, dude. I'm inside all the time. I wear black, dude. I'm like a fucking vampire. Let me show you the two extremes here. Right now, that is actual sunlight coming into my office here. And let me go ahead and show you exactly what happens when I change that white balance again. And you can see the desired effect that you might want to achieve of that being white. Now, generally, that's the white balance that you are trying to color correct. That's my main light. I want that to be white, which right now it kind of looks like it is. It might look a little bit more blue or a little bit more orange, so I got to change it. Now, again, let me show you the two ends of the spectrum. Now it looks like maybe it's very early morning or it's kind of cold in my office. Maybe it's snowing outside or something like that. You don't really know. The white balance is a huge... Now, this gets into the color correction territory, so... You know, take this with a whatever, but you know, it looks a little blue, right? Now, normally if I want that light, that is normal natural light coming into my office and I'm feeling it's looking too blue. So I got to add warm light to it using the white balance until it looks good to my eye. Here's the opposite end of the spectrum. It almost looks like I got a light in here that is, you know, like a light bulb or something like that. Or maybe it's getting to be a little sunset. You know what I mean? It just plays into how you want your setup to look and how you want your situation to look, as well as maybe you just want to correct some light that's coming into your office. And right now this is looking a little sunsetty, or maybe the morning sun just came up or something like that. Now, let's say I want to dial this in to clean white light and I'm not liking how warm this is looking. I dial down the white balance. Now, generally, 5600 is what you want your light set to when you're filming with daylight. Now, I can't be 100%, you know, honest here, as this light next to me is a little bit warmer than it should be, and this light behind me, giving this little edge, is a little bit colder. So maybe the back wall is the better example to look at. So basically, I'm trying to get this to feel like the white that I want it to feel like, and that is using color temperature to change that. The higher you have this number here, the more orange and warmer the light is going to look. It's trying to counter the blue light coming in. So daylight being this blue light, me setting this to 5600 makes that blue light look a little more warmer and a little more natural to the eye. Whereas, you know, if I went back to 3200, which is what normal light bulbs and whatnot, when you're in your house and it's nighttime. So 3200 is generically the white balance you would set for if you were filming at night and you're in your house and you got those nice warm light bulbs and whatnot. And the blue is added using the white balance. The blue is added to counteract the warm light. Basically, it's trying to counter the lighting that you have to make everything balanced. It is a white balance. So it's trying to balance out that light. And right now that's looking a little too cold for me. So I would put it back at 48 where I had it, although 56 would be the better option. So sitting back at 48, this is where our lighting sits at, and that's what white balance is for. And it's just kind of how I think it looks pretty good to my eye. So that's where I've left it. So this concludes kind of like the generic camera settings setup for each camera and how different cameras can look by their settings and whatnot. Okay, so to recap, we talked about shutter speed. Shutter speed is motion blur, how much motion blur you want versus how much you are trying to use the shutter speed to control the amount of light coming into your camera. We talked about f-stop, which is the amount of light going into the lens. Again, the lower the f-stop, the smaller the number, The larger the aperture, the shallower depth of field you get, as well as more light comes through. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you would close down your f-stop to an f22 or something like that, and that allows less light to come in, as well as you get more things in focus. We covered ISO, which is basically your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the number of your ISO, the more grain and ugliness you get, but you're able to see more of your environment and your room and whatnot. So the lower you go on that number, the darker the image will be, but the cleaner it'll be. So you got to find out what is good for you and what works best in your environment in terms of your camera's sensitivity, its ISO. And then lastly, we talked about white balance. White balance controls the color of white in your scene, in your camera's image. So if you were outside and you set your white balance to a certain Kelvin, it's going to look either warmer or cooler. It's going to be up to you how much you want to adjust that to affect your image. And right now I have mine set to 4800, so my skin looks a little warm on this side. Yeah, just keep those in mind, and hopefully you're able to set your image to what you want. Hopefully these settings help you out. Don't forget, we talked about frames per second, how you feel about that when you're setting your FPS. Do you want more smoothness, or do you want something a little more cinematic looking at a 24 FPS, something like that? So to recap, we talked about shutter speed, and that's the amount of motion blur you have in a scene. However fast you're moving your arms and whatnot. One can look a little bit more crazy and one can look a little less crazy, but it also helps you control the amount of light coming into your camera. A lower shutter speed, meaning 1/low number, that'll allow more light in your camera, but it will also increase the amount of motion blur that comes into the camera as well. The higher that number, the 1/high number, is a very small motion blur and can start to look a little crazy. It's good for sports and whatnot, and fast movement if you want to catch everything very crisp. We also talked about f-stop. Now, f-stop is what controls the amount of light coming into your camera. Whether you're outside and you have a higher f-stop number, something like an f16, f22, that allows you to get less light to your camera's sensor by closing down all the little blades on the inside of your lens, but it also makes it so you don't get that shallow depth of field, because everything, all your blur, all your depth of field gets just extreme, where everything looks sharp and in focus. And if you go to the opposite end, you got a wide open f-stop, which is on my camera right here, an f1.5. That allows for a very shallow depth of field where I'm in focus here and I'm out of focus back here. It also allows way more light into my camera if I'm in a dark environment, and the lower you can get that number, the better you can see into darkness. We also covered ISO. ISO is your camera sensitivity. The higher the ISO, the more noise you get, but you're able to see into darker environments better. You have to kind of do a little trade-off here, because the lower the ISO you go, light will not hit the sensor as strong or as powerful, and you'll need more light to compensate, but you'll also have a really clean looking image with very little grain, but it's all up to your lighting situation and where you are streaming from or filming. So if you're outside and you have that number at a low, 100 ISO, you're going to be able to see very little grain and very little noise in your image, and it's going to look very clean, at the cost of hoping that you have enough light to be able to shoot outside at that ISO. Right now I'm sitting at 250 ISO, but my lens at a 1.5 is allowing me to see into this room very easily. This camera has great sensor, and it's very, very crisp and clean, and I like it a lot. Lastly, we talked about white balance. White balance is what controls the white light. You were trying to balance that light, the white light, to your taste, whether that be a cold look or a warmer look, or maybe you're just trying to get rid of how the wall looks orange or blue, and you're just gonna add a little bit more of one or the other. And yeah, you can also let it set to automatic white balance, and that'll kind of do its own thing and go through some processes to try to turn whatever light you want into white light, and let the camera do its job and try to figure it out for you. That's the end of this video. If you guys have questions or anything like that, comment down below, man. I've seen a lot of people, Dr. Lupo, people that use mirrorless cameras and DSLRs in their streams, they all don't really understand all the settings. They're kind of just doing like an auto mode, or maybe they'll dial it in, but they're using the wrong setting to dial in. Like maybe they're using the shutter speed instead of the f-stop, or maybe they're using the f-stop instead of their ISO to try to control the amount of light. And I'm here to get you guys the cleanest image and the best looking image that you can, utilizing your camera's capabilities without you using the wrong setting, so that things start to look weird. Hopefully this helps someone out there. I've helped a few casters out there, and I'm hoping that this will help someone else in the future. That's the end of this video. Appreciate you guys watching. Like and subscribe. It would help. Or just comment down below if you have questions. And I think my camera's actually getting flared from the light behind me. You see like the blacks in my hoodie here. You see how they're changing. You see how everything looks a little more washed out when I allow that light to hit. This little, I have a light right here. So I put this little piece of tape on top of my lens that like kind of shades the light hitting the lens. And then I usually use this aspect ratio thing because I like that little bit more cinematic look. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Do appreciate it. Catch my streams Monday through Friday from 11 a.m. Eastern to 5 p.m. Eastern. I live in Brooklyn. So if you guys ever want to come by, ask me any camera questions or anything like that, feel free to drop on in. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. If you guys are new, subscribe to the channel maybe, or think about it, and tell your friends, man. Tell all your friends to come in and sub. That'd be great. Thanks. Hopefully this was informative. Now I got to go edit this, and I'm not looking forward to it because that's going to take me forever because I say a lot. I probably recorded this. Oh, this is an hour and a half video that I just recorded. Great job. You get the short version. I get the long version. I got to cut out all my ums and hms and ahs and, you know, getting up and anyways, until next time. Thank you guys for watching. Catch you next time. Thank you. Appreciate you. Goodbye. And this is where I fade out using my logo.